Good evening and welcome to the Arundel Camera Club live stream for Wednesday, February 10th, 2021. My name is John Milliker and I'm the club president for the 2020-2021 season. The Arundel Camera Club was founded in 1957 and exists to promote the arts, science, and education in all aspects and fields of photography. Normally we meet at 7 p.m. every Wednesday evening during the school year in Severna Park, Maryland. However, with the current disruptions, we've decided to continue business as normal in a virtual space, which allows us to protect our members and guests from the current COVID-19 situation. For more information about us, please visit www.arundelcameraclub.org. And now I'll turn it over to our programs chair, Christine, for the upcoming schedule.
Welcome. Next week on February 17th is our photo competition. The theme is close-up or macro. Please get your images in by Tuesday, February 16th at noon. On February 24th is a program by David Loria on Washington, D.C., A Photographer's Paradise. Reminder that our February photo assignment is also due on February 24th by 6 p.m. Please send in up to 3 photos to programs@arundelcameraclub.org. And the topic for February is translucent and transparent. On March 3rd is our February photo assignment discussion, and we will be talking about our photos that were submitted the prior week. And then on March 10th is a program by Connie Imboden on 34 years of nudes, water, and mirrors. Tonight, we have Irene Sacalato with her program on A Passion for Wildlife Photography, and I'm going to turn this over to her. Welcome, Irene.
Hello all, let's get over to share. Let me see if I can find the little button down the bottom here. There it be. Hold on one second. And I'll be over, hopefully. There she should be. And should be good.
We have you up. You're good.
You got me up there. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Irene Hinkie-Sacalato. I'm with Osprey Photo Workshops and Tours, and I've been doing photo programs since actually the early 80s. I was one of the first ones doing photo workshops at the time. Now I'm just one of many. My website is listed here. It's ospreyphoto.com. On that website, you can find information about what photo workshops are coming up. There's an image gallery, blogs, and also there's a place to sign up for my newsletter that comes out about every 2 months. I got one that should be coming out at the beginning of March. It'll be dealing with a little project that I've had at a friend's house with a wren, a scarecrow, and a cowbird. And it's got some other information on one of the software plugins. And I do small groups. I scout the locations ahead of time. I don't shoot with the people. Any shooting I do is either before or after the workshop. But if you notice down the bottom there, Assateague, Chincoteague, West Virginia Mountains, Badlands, Tangier, Bosque, Florida's East Coast are some of the places I visit. Okay, and with that, I'm going to talk about wildlife photography. It is my passion. I'm going to show you a cute little video. I want you to observe. There is a fox. There is somewhere in here a squirrel that's going to head for that tree, but the fox isn't interested in him. He's after this one. This one's not too bright. The fox will be on it before the squirrel knows it. And it's interesting to watch the posture of the fox. The squirrel does not die, although it looks pretty bad. And they'll zigzag back and forth. And one of the other things to observe is the fact that they're pretty close together at times. Oopsie, and it's my fault. There we should go. Here he comes. Low profile. Got the squirrel. Ouch, ouch. At the tree, he's almost nails it, but I believe the squirrel made it to one of the trees, which he could not climb. Okay, what I'm going to talk about is some of the requirements for wildlife photography: lighting and composition, exposure, locating and approaching animals, capturing action, and safety and ethics. And my real motivation for photographing wildlife is I find wildlife absolutely fascinating. The variety, the adaptations, the specific behaviors that are with different species. It's just unbelievable what animals can do. And I enjoy sharing my experiences with other people. One of the things I really like is with the images, sometimes I capture things that I couldn't see with my eye. In other words, we're freezing moments in time. So this is a dowitcher. It has a bill that if you looked in the bird books, you'd see it was a straight bill, looks pretty rigid, and however, in this picture, you can tell that it's not totally rigid. At the end of that bill are tactile sensors. He can manipulate the end of the bill and probe down into whatever substrate he might be feeding in, and he can feel around for organisms. I like puffins, and I knew they could fly, and I knew that they could go catch fish underwater and use their wings to be able to do that, but I had no idea that a little puffin like this, when he goes to scratch, needed a little help with balance, and so he used his wing. So I like capturing things that I don't normally see in books or whatever. I also like this little guy. This was shot in Assateague, and the first thing that I saw was this little rabbit. He was just eating on the ground, and all of a sudden he hops up on this fence rail, and I'm going, hey, that's pretty cool. He's sitting there and he's eating. I'm going to get a number of shots of this, and I did. And then all of a sudden he blows my mind, and he stands up. Perfectly balanced, no problem. I have no idea what was so interesting about that piece of dried grass that he's nibbling on, but apparently it was worth the effort. Let's see, again, I like humor in wildlife behavior. This is a young bear, and he's having a heck of a time holding on to that salmon that he caught. This is a standoff. I like the mirrored images of both the fox and the mouse. The mouse, as you guessed, didn't make it, but I like capturing interesting situations like this. This was done at Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. You can have the best equipment in the world, but that doesn't mean a thing unless you have other characteristics. You've got to be imaginative, creative. You will need to know something about the animal, and you also need to know your camera very well. You need a great deal of patience and perseverance to get the great images. And I'm definitely a curious person. What's going on? I always want to know. Careful observation is very important. You sort of build up a database of information that you can tap into later, whether consciously or unconsciously, to get an idea what the animal is going to do. The more you know about animals or a particular animal, the better your chances of getting an interesting photo. You can get the information about where and when to find something, what it's doing, and so forth. You can go to the internet. You've got past observations to look to. Even hunters provide some interesting information, and certainly your camera club members would. One of the things I know about this turkey here, he's got his tail fanned. That's part of the strut. He's got his wings down. He's dragging them on the ground. He's got his chest out. He is either seeing another tom turkey that he wants to impress, or maybe a bunch of females. And if you remember this pose, I'll talk about it a little bit later. I mentioned patience and curiosity. I happen to be, this is from November this year, or last year, shall we say, 2020, one of the good things that happened that year. I happened to be at Chincoteague, and I spotted this, it's a female kingfisher, belted kingfisher, and it was sitting on a post, and I thought, okay, I'm going to pull over, I'm going to stop, photograph it from the car. I have a bean bag in the window, which I'll talk about. I happen to take this picture with an older 600 millimeter f4 lens with a 1.4 teleconverter connected to it, and we'll talk some more about that later too. However, the important point is I watched him and photographed him maybe for an hour, hour and a half. I got all sorts of poses. He hit the water. I couldn't get shots where he actually hit the water, but I'd get him coming back up, shaking off the water, maybe being there with the fish, maybe preening, etc. This went on. It was great. And finally he flew off, and I hope to see him again. I never did. So you want to take advantage of every situation you have and be patient, and also curious of what's happening. I happen to have a photo blind in a neighbor's on one of my neighbor's property, a friend of mine. And I was photographing some foxes that would come in the early morning and late in the afternoon. And things got kind of slow towards the middle of the summer, and they started only coming out at night, but I still had the blind there. And while I'm still hoping for a fox, all of a sudden I looked across from me and there's the deer. And I went, oh boy, deer. I'm going to get lots of deer pictures now. Probably little fawns will come up here and so forth. And I had some old apples and I put them at the edge of the forest, maybe a salt block. Yeah, I'm going to get a lot of deer pictures. Well, guess what? I never saw another deer. You want to take advantage of situations because they might not happen again. The raccoon here, however, did like the apples that I put out for the deer, and so did squirrels. And I had a squirrel that grabbed one and ran up a tree with it about 30 feet before he ate it. And I kind of was amazed that he could do that. There are no two sunrises or sunsets that are identical. And whenever you get an opportunity to shoot something, don't sit there and say, I'm going to do it tomorrow. It'll be there tomorrow, because most likely it will not be there tomorrow. This was a picture I took about 4 years ago in New Mexico at Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge, and I have not been able to duplicate it. I've taken other pictures of the moon, full moon in the picture, and with maybe some snow geese flying in front of it or around it. But this is one of my favorite, with a nice early morning, it's warm light, and the wing positions are different and so forth. So it's made me happy, and I haven't been able to do it again. I have a local park. Part of the time when we're dealing with COVID, I kind of had to stay in my neighborhood. And so I'd go to the local park and I'd walk. And in one of the tree cavities, I happened to notice something gray and kind of moving, and it's not a woodpecker. Oh, it's a squirrel. So for about 4 days after that, I came back with my long lens. I sat alongside or stood alongside the path. People looked at me kind of weird. But I had opportunities to photograph the squirrel, the one that you saw early on with a paw out. That came from this setup. I call this one sheltering in place. But I got a series of great shots. But I will not be able to do this again, because if you notice the red arrow, there's the cavity. And something happened. It's been maybe 2-3 months ago now, that knocked off a large section of the tree. Maybe lightning, I am not sure. Getting the image right in the camera is certainly important. You don't want to depend on post-processing to fix all your problems. There are artists who specialize in setting up the photo for doing post-processing later. However, that's not me. 99% of my pleasure comes from shooting and not post-processing. But you want to look for things. You want to make sure the eye is sharp. You can't fix that in post-processing, or at least you can't very well. If the subject's moving, the shutter speed's too slow, you have problems. If you've got shadows where you don't want them, you can lighten them a little bit, but they may be major problems. You can have a background that's extremely distracting, as one you'll see later. And all of these things post-processing won't fix. I do use raw files. That's a question I often get asked, because the raw files have the most information there to be able to use in terms of color and tone. I need to be intimately familiar with my equipment. During the summer and so forth, I was shooting maybe every day, every other day on my friend's property. And I became very familiar with the camera. And I'll find the first day or two that I go to a new location, if I haven't been shooting for a while, I'm stumbling a little bit. It's really important to know your camera well, that you don't have to lower it to take a look at the controls. You got that little info button in the back that helps some. I want to be able to switch from maybe manual and autofocus back and forth if I need to. I want to know where that little ISO button is, or how to control in a automated exposure mode, to be able to control the exposure, plus or minus exposure compensation. I want to know with my zoom lens which way I turn the barrel to get more magnification. I always try to examine my images critically. In fact, when I'm shooting, I'm always trying to refine the image. I'll shoot a couple shots and I'm going, okay, this is really good. What do I see that I could do better? Is there maybe a scene, just the whole environment, or some detail on the subject? But things I've got to watch out for: is the eye sharp? Is the background okay? Are the shadows where they don't belong? Have I cut off a portion of the body? Sorry again. You need to be ready to react quickly. I saw this fox. I know something about this fox. Number one, we saw him earlier. They go after squirrels. His paw is up. He is concentrating. His ears are perked. We know something probably is going to happen, so we want to get ready for it. You want to take a good look then at how the light's hitting the subject. What kind of background are you going to have when you take the picture? What's your approach going to be? I know this guy is a bit skittish, so I'm going to use a long lens. And if I have time, I'm certainly going to check my exposure to get some kind of action shot. Photography is all about lighting. And when I see a subject, in fact, when I'm out photographing, I'm always aware of where the sun is. I take a look up in the sky. I want to know which direction it's coming to hit my subject. I want to know whether or not it's strong or weak, whether there's a light cloud that maybe cover up the sun and soften the light, or whether there's some storm clouds coming in that'll either add drama to my pictures, or perhaps cover the sun and reduce my shutter speed so that I might not get a sharp image. So one of the characteristics of light happens to be the color early in the morning. I need to be on site at least half hour to 45 minutes ahead of time so that I can capture that early morning light. It's also important to hang around after sunset because after sunset, sometimes you can get absolutely incredible images. This was actually taken as the sun was setting, and it was a real advantage. Number one, you can see how the sun is low and just skimming the surface. He's on the beach at Chincoteague. But that lovely warm light is really showing the red coat of this fox. So I mentioned him earlier. Number one, with wildlife, I often shoot early in the morning, late in the afternoon, because animals are the most active then. The other thing about the light at that point in time is it's soft and it's warm. That warmth shows up all these beautiful iridescent feathers on this particular turkey. The first I saw him, he was doing the strut that you saw earlier. And I'm going, okay, why is he doing this? What's around? Okay, there's about 5 or 6 females over there. One of them's going along and it's stooping. It'll go long, stoop, get up, move on, stoop, get up, move on. And that particular behavior I have observed with other birds. Also, even mammals, the female lots of times will assume some kind of submissive position. So I had a choice. I could go and shoot something else and say to double with it. I got a couple pictures of the male strutting and that's all. And I don't feel like I'm going to wait around for an hour or so for something to happen. Or I could do what I just did, which was stay with the subject as long as necessary. And eventually I got this shot. One of the things I had to be very careful about, I mentioned shadow problems. If he leaned forward, he would cover the eye and the face of the female. And I saw these beautiful colors in his feathers. And I said, you know, I like environmental scenes, I like behavioral shots, but I also like some details. So I took some time with one of the turkeys that I saw to actually photograph just the feathers. Light has quality besides color. It's either light or strong and contrasty. I like soft light. Soft light comes early in the morning, late in the afternoon. Also, if you have a light cloud that goes over the sun, hazy day. When we had the fires on the West Coast and the smoke came over the East Coast early on, one of the things I found, I had 2 great days of shooting because I had soft light the whole day. It was absolutely wonderful. Open shade is another place that you'll have soft light. So what is the benefit of having soft light? Number one, it adds to the mood here. Number two, I don't have any harsh shadows on the subject that are going to block key features. In the case of the Willett here, he's backed by waves in the background. If it was bright and sunny, that white area would be extremely distractive. It would be bright and strong and take away attention from this particular shorebird. And the same thing with the green kingfisher down there. If I had, this was very late in the afternoon, I was really absolutely surprised. I'll talk some more about using a tripod, but I was using a tripod. I was using a cable release, so I didn't touch the camera to have the camera very still because it was getting really close to sunset. But the nice thing about it, it was soft light and that beautiful background worked out really well. If it had been a contrasty day, a bright sunny day, I would have a lot of distraction behind that particular bird. Animals in the woods, certainly soft light is your best opportunity to be able to photograph them well. You don't want a situation where you have a lot of contrast in the picture, bright highlights, dark shadows. Soft light helps retain detail on white subjects. One of the interesting things is with this picture is, number one, we have some tonal gradient here. You can almost sense the muscle in the swan's wing. Also, you have detail on the feathers. As the light gets brighter and brighter during the day, and it's no longer soft light, what happens is the white feathers cast light into the shadows, and when they do that, they end up lighting everything on the bird and it looks flat. Let's talk about the direction of light from behind me directly on a subject. In the case of this is a black-bellied plover in winter plumage, or plover, depending on how you want to say it. Front lighting gives me a lot of detail. It gives me the sharp eye, I can see the feather detail, etc. However, side lighting, it can be really interesting. It breathes life into the image. It shows texture. It shows three-dimensionality. And the feathers that are between the bill of this particular ibis, they almost look like they're coming off the page. This shot was done in the early morning. This was also a Chincoteague shot early in the morning, and we've got side lighting there, and it's just a little different picture than you normally see of great blue herons. Light that comes from behind, like hair light, for instance, we've got the bear, the edges of his fur. It's all lit by the sun behind him. Also, the water droplets are showing up very nicely because of the light coming from behind. But we got the snowy egret. We got the beautiful feathers here, lights passing through. The same thing with this fellow. We've got hair light here. It's golden. That's because the sun was going down. The light was just coming through the trees enough that it hit the floor of this wooded area in a little shaft of golden light, and he walked into it, and I got 2 shots, and I was really happy. Backlighting where the light passes through something can be very dramatic, as in the cases of these guys. If you're pointing the camera towards the sun, watch out for bright spots, kind of hexagonal spots that are called flare spots. Usually they're unwanted. And the way you avoid them, number 1, is use your lens shade. Number 2, if you could shade the lens itself, sometimes I do it with a jacket. Sometimes you can stand in a shaded area and avoid some problems. Backlighting also is great for silhouettes. You want some kind of lit background that has some color, and you want the subject to be recognizable by shape alone, not anything to do with any detail. I know this is a large heron, most likely knowing where I took this picture. Either it was a great blue heron or maybe what I called a common egret or great egret. I also know he's got a fish. All that's useful information. However, when he walks forward, he is going to disappear. He's going to emerge into that shadow area. Here's a good example of merging. I had a devil of a time with these ducks waiting for them to separate like this. When they clump like this, that's not particularly desirable. And that was certainly the case with these guys. I laid flat on the ground to be able to separate the land from the whole penguin silhouette. If I had stood up, I'd only have the top of the penguins. The land would merge with the bottoms. Looking in the direction of sunset or sunrise sometimes doesn't have great results. There's nothing there to photograph. Okay, take and turn around, look at the sky. Lots of times the clouds will pick up some of the colors from the setting sun, and you might have a subject there that's a lot more interesting than what you had looking at the sun, and that was the case here. Different kinds of weather conditions can be very helpful. Fog can produce interesting shots, but what I really don't like is heavy overcast days. Heavy overcast days, you got a problem. You got a really gray sky, and that gray sky, if you got water in the picture, it's going to be gray. Are you going to see all those brilliant red bills on these black skimmers? Nope. You need sunlight to do that. It's a very flat looking shot. Also, because the light is very low, I'm having difficulty freezing the action. I much prefer a day that's got a little bit of sun, maybe some clouds, and you get some beautiful color that's reflected into the water. I also have a shutter speed fast enough that you can see the bubbling action of this. It's American widgeon, and he's feeding at the time. Also, because there's some sun, I can pick up those beautiful iridescent feathers on the head of this particular widgeon. If you look at the other picture up in the corner, he's got a nice wing position, but he ain't too pretty. The light is not complementing his colors. If you have a subject that happens to be black, you would definitely need a little bit of sun to be able to show the highlights. You want to be looking for these nice highlights. Otherwise, you just get a flat black head. I like the water droplets on this guy too. I don't use flash very often. There are other photographers that do. I find it awkward, but in the case of this hummingbird, it was raining. And the only way I was going to bring out the iridescent colors on this particular hummingbird, this was in Costa Rica, was to use fill flash. In the upper left-hand corner, you have a nice little heron. I shot this at Tangier Island, where I do some workshops, but not this year, because there's no place to gather, shall we say, in any numbers. So Tangier is interesting. It's made up of 3 ridges with tidal guts in between. So I could sit there and photograph the tidal guts and the animals that live there and fish there. And I saw this nice heron. I'm going, oh, great. He's fishing. Okay, I'm going to get some nice shots of him fishing. Oh boy, he caught a fish. Okay, I got some action there. Okay, the water's bubbling. Okay, oh, and I got a reflection of him. And this is going to be such a great picture. And I get it, and I look at it, I'm going, it's not such a great picture. The shadows are kind of distracting compared to the image below, where I've frozen the water droplets in the air. You have some tonal gradient on the back of the heron, but you don't have any problems with any kind of shadows around the eye, etc. Much nicer picture. When I see a subject, one of the things that I've got to determine is what's compelling about it. Why did I stop? What attracted me to it? If I want to transmit any kind of idea that I was having when I saw the subject to somebody that's viewing the picture, I've got to identify what it is. What I liked about him, the camouflage, and also the eye stalks that kind of make him look like an alien. So I had to choose a camera position and make sure those eye stalks were very sharp to be able to transmit to others my amazement at this particular little crab. This flamingo, it was the curves. The curves just wowed me. Oh, the beautiful feathers, the curve in the neck, the curves around the eye, around the bill, etc. So it made no sense to me to take a picture of the whole flamingo with the legs and all, because that wasn't what was important. So eliminating the non-essential is part of getting a great photo, and I did that here. I mentioned backgrounds can be a problem, and this one would be hard to clean up. I got some great action there. They're two sandhill cranes, and they're disputing. Lots of times when one bird lands into the territory of another, you get some reaction. Periodically, you'll get a pause out of me as I sip some water. I would prefer some kind of out of focus background that is a lot simpler so that you can actually see the subject. I want to talk a little bit about this fox. This was one of the fox. It had chased some squirrels. It missed. It's heading back to the woods. I'm in the blind, and definitely I'm guessing he saw me, but he's not rushing too much, and he's got some nice sunlight on him. I had to lighten the tail a little bit in post-processing. But the thing I want to point out here is he stands out from this background very nice. Perfect. 15 minutes later, I couldn't have gotten that shot because that whole background, all those bushes, all those leaves, etc., would be picking up sunlight, and he would just blend into them, and it would be a distracting background instead of what I had. I mentioned earlier with silhouettes to avoid clumping. I try not to get overlay of one subject on top of the other. In this case, these cranes were flying in front of the tree, and they just disappear into it, as opposed to the picture down the bottom where we've got a nice flow of birds and pretty much separated. This little hummingbird, there was only 3 in my friend's backyard that ever showed up in the summer, and this was taken at about a 4,000th of a second. I didn't want to use flash. It would hard to predict where he was going to be, etc. I actually left room around the edges of the frame because I didn't know which way he was going to come into that flower. Sometimes he approached from the bottom, sometimes from the top, sometimes from the side, sometimes he just hovered. So one thing about leaving a little extra room around the flower, it was hopefully so I could get him in the frame. The second reason is by having a little less magnification, I got a little more depth of field, and I had a little better chance of making sure that that little guy was sharp. Let's talk about the rules of composition, which are really guidelines, and you can ignore them if you got a reason to. We'll talk about that. One of them, you got the rule of thirds: avoid centering a subject, don't cut off portions of a subject like a tail or a foot. But in this case, there's no problem here. The flower is kind of centered. The wings of the butterflies are cut off, but that doesn't matter. You often prefer odd number of key features in the frame instead of even, but I got even number here. Who cares? All movement must be frozen in space. No, that's not the case either. So let's take a look at some examples. Here's an example of a boring picture. This is why you don't put things in the center, particularly if everything you take a picture of is in the center. You could crop this picture and get him out of dead center, but I don't have a lot of detail on this subject, and I imagine if I crop this image, I would lose some resolution on the bird. Here we've got, the head of the osprey is in the center. Oh, boo-boo. No, We've got some great action here. We have a nice diagonal of the wing. We got some nice splashing water. And besides that, we have a beautiful reflection underneath the osprey. This guy, yeah, I did cut off a portion of him, but his whole body wasn't so important to me. What was important to me, number one, it was the patterns. Beautiful snake. It's a prairie rattler. And also, I just love the curves. You want subjects to be moving into the frame. Usually I'll leave a little space in front than behind, like this group of birds. You don't want to have the subjects going out of the frame. So this fox is a perfect example of how I like to align things. I want some more space in front of the subject, usually, and a little less behind. There's almost an occupation of that space due to movement and due to this guy's stare. You got some kind of story going on here. That's a good thing. His paws up, he's poised. Those eyes are focused on something. Those ears are up, and you're just wondering what he's going after. And I like the nice diagonal in the picture too. But not always do I leave room in front. If there's something interesting behind a subject like this wake that picked up the colors from the sky, we got some nice reflections. I composed it that way. One of the things to watch out for is out of focus foreground. Out of focus foreground frequently pulls the attention of the viewer away from the main subject. And in this case, not only did I cut off, I had the out of focus foreground, but I cut off the foot. And there was nothing I could do to reconstruct that in the picture. If I could have gotten a little higher, but I was shooting from the car, I couldn't get out of the car, I would have scared him away. I did put another beanbag on top of the one beanbag, but I still wasn't high enough. Mainly what I did later when I showed this picture is I concentrated on what was important to me, which was this area here, that this is in Bosque del Apache. They plant grains for the birds. It's near the Rio Grande River. And used to be farmers did it, and now the refuge people do it. And it provides food for a lot of waterfowl. In the case of this turkey, it was with a group of 60 other turkeys. Eyes are important, windows to the soul. The eye needs to be sharp. If it's not sharp, the rest of the image is not perceived as being sharp. Highlight in the eye is a good thing. Contrast draws you into the picture. The fact that I've got a little extra light around the eyes, that's a good thing. And also, when you have eye contact between you as the photographer and the animal, it creates a very intense image. This guy, again, the eye was important. He's definitely looking for food. In the case of this guy, it's the attitude. The eye is sharp, number one, and there's attitude in that eye, in that he looks like the sly fox. I frequently take a burst of shots. I put the camera on continuous autofocus, and if I have groups like this and they're moving, I will take a burst of shots, a high number of frames per second. And one of the reasons is, number one, you can see with these ducklings that, eye may be sharp, but the eye is closed. That's not good. Sometimes they have that little, if they're divers, they have a little thin membrane that comes down over the eye to protect it. And that also doesn't create the best effect. However, in some of the other shots that I got of these guys, the eyes are wide open. The birds are actually a little bit sharper than the ones above. They're a little closer together. They're a little bit more within my depth of field. Even with solitary subjects that are not doing a whole lot, I'll often take a couple shots. There are reasons for that. Sometimes that little membrane drops and I didn't see it. Sometimes they tilt their head a little bit. And if you look at the image on the left, you can see that the eye is in shadow. Sometimes they move a little bit with one shot and they're perfectly still with the next. This guy caused some problems. He was a cute little young bunny. He was very cooperative. He paid no attention to me, but he moved a lot. And I was using the particular lens I have. I can put it on a mode that I can go from autofocus to manual fairly quickly. And I needed to do that because if the camera was on an autofocus mode, frequently the camera and that focusing device would lock on the grass instead of the eye of the bunny rabbit. I also had some problems with grass going across the eye, which was not good either. So I'd switch back and forth. Some of my shots were done with autofocus, and some of them I autofocused and then quickly concentrated on the eye and manually got that into sharp focus. Okay, you have a number of different modes for focusing, and often the cameras have like a single point autofocus. I'm using continuous autofocus again to follow the action here, but the single point is good when you can put the focus sensor over the eye. I got a number of pictures of him as I followed him around because I've got what I call the dancer, little yoga stretch there. But if I have a bird in the air, lots of times I'll use some kind of group arrangement of focus sensors, and different cameras perform better with different modes. Your new mirrorless, there's entirely different selections for following action, and some of the mirrorless cameras actually do have eye detection, and it works fairly well. I know the Canon R5, I believe, is one of those. But I can use a group because I don't have anything else to interfere, and I want to keep that group right over that eye as he flies by. Okay, this guy, this is part of the story that I'll tell in my newsletter, but he nested in this scarecrow. Where he's sitting is right up here on the shoulder. He would go down into this hole. Down inside, there's a pocket, and that's where the nest was, as Carolina Wren. I knew where he's kind of going to land, so I could pre-focus there and just put on a manual focus and wait for him to land and take the shots. But I wanted a little more flexibility, and I used what's called back button focusing that a lot of camera clubs talk about. It's where you assign a button on the back of the camera to handle focusing, and your shutter release button is primarily to activate your light meter and to fire the camera. And the reason why this works fairly well is if I push that button in and I have the autofocus point on this little board here, and I take my finger off, it stays focused there. If the bird, however, moves and he moves off that point, I can push that button in and put the focus sensor over the bird and following him about as he moves from one location to the next. I say curiosity, imagination are kind of the fun things about photography. And I saw the snake, and there were a number of these small snakes in this pond. And I got the normal shot of him sitting on a log, and that was okay. But I was curious of what it would be like to be on the ground with him. And so I laid down in front of him and let him come towards me and took a series of shots to get this one. Trying to be on eye level with your subject is a good idea. If you know when you photograph children, you don't want to just stand up and shoot down at them. Not a very good perspective. You get some distortion, their head looks big, etc. And the same thing goes with animals. Also, it's a lot more intimate picture. By the way, I have no idea how he was able to eat that particular cactus with all those spines. The other thing about being on eye level with the subject is the background is further away. So therefore, it has less chance of being distracting. The subject stands out a lot better. That one is also the case. But sometimes I don't do that. Sometimes I don't want to be eye level because if I was eye level, I'd have a bunch of stuff in the background I didn't want, and I'd rather have the bird against the sky. This is a black-browed albatross on the Falkland Islands. And if I had shot him from a higher angle, I would have a whole bunch of other mud nests in the background and a lot of other birds. So I liked the simplicity of this. Also, it really shows and emphasizes the length of that wing. He's practicing flying because he's going to spend most of his life out over the ocean. They only come to land to breed. This guy, I'm certainly not going to go down there with him. In fact, what really fascinated me about him is how comfy he looks lying in these rocks. And also part of his body kind of reflects the shape of some of the rocks as well. If you want a reflection, you're just going to make sure that you're at an angle, maybe a little bit higher angle to make sure you get the whole reflection. I want to take a minute to talk about lenses, and give me a second to have a sip here. Okay. I'm not going to spend much time on close-up photography. In other words, something like this butterfly, insects, etc., flowers. But I have a 100 and a 200 millimeter, what's called a macro lens. It's a lens that's specifically designed for high magnification. You can get very close to the subject and still be able to focus on it, and you may get one-to-one magnification with it. The difference between the 100 and the 200 is operating distance or working distance. The 100, you're closer to the subject. You may not want to be closer to that subject if it's a tarantula, for instance. The 200 gives you double the working space, so you're back further. You're not going to maybe disturb the animals. Your shadow may not fall across it if you're back a little distance. The thing that's important about high magnification, and it'll be repeated later, is that you need to keep the face of the lens parallel to the surface of your subject. I wanted to make sure the wing here was sharp, the eye and the proboscis was sharp. And you'll see later how shallow the depth of field really is when you're shooting small birds. Telephoto lenses, of course I use telephoto lenses. They isolate and they magnify, but they do some other things that you might want to be aware of. Number one, they compress distances between objects. In other words, those posts are a lot further apart than it appears here. He looks like he's just barely making it between them. Probably they were like 4 feet apart. Other thing I like about this one is he happens to have breeding colors. That green is reflected in the green of the poles. Also used a long lens for these guys because I wanted to emphasize this feeling of crowd, and also they don't look happy. So I shot them with a 300 millimeter lens. I used another characteristic of the telephoto lens, the fact that it has a narrow angle of view. That means if you have a background that's distracting behind the subject, sometimes you can move just a little bit and change your camera angle just slightly and get an entirely different background. For instance, the spotlighting effect came from the fact that the bird was out in sunlight, but I had chosen an angle where I had shadows in the background. There was a teeny bit of light coming through, and I took care of that in post-processing. But I love the translucent of the crab there, soft crab. Yeah, for little birds like this little painted bunting, I do use my long lens. You saw I used that for the kingfisher earlier. I have a 600 millimeter f4 lens. It is heavy. It is a beast. I don't like carrying it long distances. But I got as close as I could to this little bird, this little bunting. And it wasn't big enough in the frame, and I couldn't get any closer because I couldn't focus anymore. I was too close. So I whipped out what's called a teleconverter. I had a 1.4 teleconverter. It goes between the camera body and the lens itself. It takes away a tiny bit of light, this one does, but it gives you more magnification, almost like 1.5 times. But I still wasn't happy. He still wasn't big enough. So I also had another camera with me. I might have had the Nikon D850, which is a full frame camera, but I have a D500, which is a smaller sensor camera, and it gives you more. Basically, he'd look larger in the frame. Thing I want to point out about teleconverters. Number one, you want to buy one that's matched to your lens system. Number two, I don't particularly like doublers. Some people are okay with them. What a doubler does is it doubles the size of the image. And that's all well and good, but usually the doublers are not quite as sharp. And also they take away a lot of light. As soon as you put one on, if you had a shutter speed of a 5/100th of a second, it would drop to 125. For large mammals, large birds, 300 to 400 millimeter length, focal length is satisfactory. But when you get into your smaller birds, you'd hope to have something a little bit longer. If you're going to try out wildlife photography for the first time, you can always rent lenses. I go to Service Photo in Baltimore, which happens to be a pro shop. Their people know a lot. You can handle the, at least after COVID. COVID, you might not be able to do a whole lot inside the store. However, they are extremely helpful. And so you want to support these guys so they don't disappear. I do have some zoom lenses. They have improved over the years, and the 2 to 500 I have is quite sharp, and it is the lens that I use to photograph this fella. Zoom lenses are quite handy in the fact that this guy I photographed, as you saw earlier, with the bushes and the trees around with him eating, but then I zoomed in on him with a longer focal length. I was stuck in a blind. I couldn't get any closer to be able to do that. So when you're stuck in a fixed position, a zoom lens is very good. For instance, if you're going on safari and you're in a safari vehicle and they stop at the Pride of Lions, you might want to shoot the whole Pride of Lions, but you also want to shoot some individuals. So it gives you, a zoom lens gives you that flexibility. I have a 70 to 200 zoom lens. It's an f2.8. That means its maximum aperture is f2.8, which means number one, I can use it under low light conditions, and also it is very easy to see through the viewfinder. It's a very bright image. The nice thing about that lens is at the 200 millimeter length, I can get some nice detail. You can tell that they're pelicans and there's some disputes going on. This was shot at Tangier Island. And Tangier is one of two islands in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. This one's in Virginia. Smith Island is the other one that's in Maryland. And these are the only two islands that are occupied by people. All the rest of the islands, like Highland and so forth, have gone underwater. It's an interesting picture in that we have a picture of what's called a crab shack. They don't have these particularly on Smith Island, but they're on Tangier. The watermen in the morning take their skiff out before dawn. They go out to their crab shack. That's where they got all their gear stored. They load the crab traps onto their work boats, floats, whatever they're going to be using that day, and they go off to do their crabbing, oystering, or whatever that they're doing. Sometimes I use a wide angle lens with wildlife because I want to show the environment. How in the devil does he go up the slope? This was in Zion National Park in the checkerboard area where I would find these guys hanging out. Sometimes I have a long lens on a tripod, and then over my shoulder, I have a camera mounted with a wide angle lens because when action happens like this, I can grab my wide angle lens, swing it up, and capture the whole scene as opposed to one individual. I want to talk about some problems with long lenses. Give me one more sip here. Okay, I said it has a narrow angle of view and it also magnifies a lot, which means you have a shallow depth of field. And sometimes I see a bird in the air and I line up the lens with what I think I should be seeing the bird, but I'm having trouble finding it. Lots of times I was focused on something a lot closer and then I switched to something at a distance, and the lens elements have to readjust. One of the things that can be helpful is to find something that's out close to the distance of your subject, or maybe it's a tree line, anything to get those lens elements lined up for more distant photography, and then you can swing over and capture the bird. In this case, if I was using a group arrangement, I'd have it right over top of the eye, or a single point, I'd have the autofocus point on the eye. Want to talk a little bit about exposure, shutter speed, lens openings, and ISO, and answer some questions that usually come up. And one of them is about flying birds. How do you handle flying birds? One of the things you want to do is start to lock your focus, have it on continuous autofocus, and lock your focus on the bird at a distance. And as it gets closer to you, the autofocus is going to be adjusting for you. Shutter speeds, usually with flying birds, they recommend anything from a 1/1500th to 1/2000th of a second. But with little birds like ducks, for instance, you even need something faster. You notice with that hummingbird that the shutter speed was actually probably around a 4/1000th of a second to be able to kind of stop or freeze the wing action of that bird. It didn't totally, but some. The closer the bird is to you, the more horizontally it's going to cross the frame. All of those things mean that you need faster shutter speeds. So one of the things I do, and particularly if I haven't been shooting for a while, is I'll go out to my local park, I'll find some geese, I'll find some ducks, and I play around with the autofocus. And I try to get used to what's with this camera combination with this lens, what's going to work the best. You can go to the dump, or you can go to the beach for seagulls, and you've got something to practice with. You got a lot of birds in the air, and you can practice your autofocus skills with those birds. Sometimes I don't want a fast shutter speed. 2/1000th of a second would freeze this action. I didn't want to do it. What I wanted to show, this bird basically is kind of flapping and he's putting on the brakes. He's trying to come to a stop where he can stand and fish. So allowing those tips of the wings to blur is a nice effect. And it was taken at about a 2/200th of a second. And then sometimes you want to play around with something artistic. You pan a little, you use a slow shutter speed, and you might get a shot like this. I mentioned earlier with that Green Kingfisher, I was taken at a very slow shutter speed, and I really needed to have the camera mounted on a tripod that was very sturdy. So let's talk about tripods. Tripods, if they're lightweight, is a lot better. If you're carrying them over your shoulder, etc. You would like maybe something that was carbon fiber or graphite legs that make it lighter and also easier to ship in your duffel bag when you're traveling. You want it to reach eye level without extending some kind of center column. A lot of tripods have a center column, and to reach eye level, you end up putting the camera, you raise that center column and you put the camera on top of that, and that's not very stable. What you really want to do is buy a tripod where it comes up to eye level without using that center post. So you can easily look through the viewfinder without any problems in destabilizing things. Legs locking firmly. I have had problems with some of my older tripods. I get them set up. It's that big lens. We're talking 13 pounds plus 5 probably from the camera. All of a sudden, one of the legs starts to go down, and I'm struggling trying to get it to stop and go back up into position. And that wasn't a very good situation. So I was in Norway with it was Joe McDonald and Marianne and several other people. We're on a boat. We were out there photographing for polar bears and walrus, etc. But I got talking to Marianne, and I said, "Darn, I got this problem." And I told her what it was, and she says, "Oh, we had that problem too, and we ended up buying tripods from Really Right Stuff. It's a Versa series." And I went to their website, and I found out that it was expensive, but I got a new tripod, and it sets up easily and it stays in position, and that makes me very happy. Turning the camera, taking the stabilization off, picking the right mode. Some cameras have a mode for putting a camera on a tripod. This particular lens is older, and I definitely have to turn off image stabilization with this particular lens, or it'll cause some vibrations and it'll blur my images. So you really need to check your lens and your camera and what the recommendations are in terms of whether you use the stabilizer, you use it in a certain mode, or whether you turn it off altogether. By the way, mirrorless lenses, if you get the mirrorless lens plus the camera that's mirrorless, lots of times you have image stabilization both in the body and also in the lens itself. Let's talk about what I put on top of the tripod to hold the camera. In the bottom corner here, we do have what's called an Arca Swiss ball head. Really Right Stuff makes one too. I can adjust the tension on the ball. It works really well with smaller lenses. I did just fine with it for a long time, even with some of the longer lenses. But when it would get in an area like Bosque del Apache, which is dusty, and it was cold in the mornings, I started having problems with it locking up. It wouldn't pan smoothly. And so from then on, I said the devil with that. I'll carry that for some small lenses, etc. But I'm going to use what's called a gimbal mount. Wimberley makes them, or one of the first manufacturers, but there are other people that do make these mounts. What you can do is adjust the position of the lens camera on this particular device, and you can put it in a position that if you loosen the knob here, it just floats. It doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, it's perfectly balanced, and it makes it very easy for panning. It's got this other knob here that allows it to go in one direction and the other one goes up and down. So you'll see these a lot in places where people are photographing flying birds. Why is a tripod important? Number one, at slow shutter speed, you're going to get sharper images. Number two, you've got something that's stable there, and you can very carefully check your focus. You can very carefully look around the edges of the frame to get good composition. And if you're hand holding a lens, lots of times you get a little fatigued and you lower the lens a little bit, and all of a sudden the action happens and you're not ready for it. So tripods are a benefit. Let's talk about f-stop, and that has to do with the lens opening. The lower that f number, or f-stop, the larger the lens opening. So if I have a lens that's maximum aperture is 5.6, if I want a shallow depth of field, I will use maybe 5.6 f8, because the lower f numbers give you a shallow depth of field, and they also are the biggest lens openings for that lens, and so they let a lot of light in, and you have your best chances of freezing action with a low f number. If you, however, need more depth of field, I'll show you a situation next, then you want a higher f number. And in the case of this tree frog down below, tropical tree frog, what was important to me were the eyes. So that shallow depth of field helped really emphasize those red eyes on that frog, which was what fascinated me about him. If you have several subjects in the frame, then you're going to need a little more depth of field. Depth of field is the amount of scene that's in focus, in front of what you're focusing on and behind. 1/3 in front, 2/3 behind. And if I wanted all these guys to their eyes to be sharp, probably shooting close to wide open with that lens wasn't going to give me that. Mom might be sharp, but the rest of them aren't. So I would increase my f number to go up to maybe f16, f22 to be able to guarantee that all the little raccoons were in focus. And particularly if you magnify a lot, hopefully these guys are fairly close together. Because the more you magnify, the shallower the depth of field becomes. And sometimes you go to f16 and both, for instance, swans here, trumpetal swans, would not be in focus. I had a lot of problems with that this year with at Chincoteague with tundra swans. They'd be in a nice position and interesting, and I'd take the picture and the one in the front was sharp, but I didn't make it with the one in the back. I mentioned that the more you magnify, the less your depth of field becomes. You can very easily see it here. This is a small bird. It's a little sanderling. Just like the butterfly, I had to be very careful that the face of the lens was parallel to the surfaces that I wanted to capture sharply. That meant the eye, and that also meant the wing detail. We'll talk about another thing that affects exposures, and that's ISO, the sensitivity of that sensor in your camera to light. A couple years ago, if I put my camera on an ISO of 400, sometimes I started picking up some kind of electric interference, electric amplified signal here, which looks like grain, sort of like grain in a film camera. That camera is not my favorite anymore because it's not very good at high ISOs, and sometimes I have to shoot at higher ISOs like a 3200 here with this Fox. He was at the edge of the woods. It was early in the morning. He was relatively still. So I had maybe a shutter speed of 1/25th, maybe 2/50th. I was really lucky, maybe even a 60th that I was able to freeze him. But at a 3200 ISO, I ended up picking up noise in the background. You can see where the red arrow is pointing. You can see some pixelation there, some sign of grain. One of the things you can do is there is a slider in both Lightroom and in Photoshop that you can use to reduce the grain a little bit. However, I've had pretty good luck with a third party, what's called a plugin. It's a small software program that I can use in conjunction with Photoshop. And it's called Topaz. That's the company, and Denoise AI is the plugin. And it has been very useful in taking care of noise like the one that you see in the upper image. And it makes the Fox really stand out very nicely. It has a masking of, you can mask out certain areas so the noise doesn't affect them and so forth. They also make another one that I haven't played too much with, but it's called Topaz AI, but it's Sharpen. So it's Sharpen AI. And in the upper image, I didn't use it. In the lower image, I did. And you can see there is slight sharpening that occurs. It looks pretty natural in that lower image of the bird flying of the duck. Just a couple things about metering. Number one, the normal metering situations you have. Usually you use matrix. Usually you have a choice between matrix metering, where it's kind of a sophisticated metering. It looks a lot of things and it compares to other examples and whatever. And usually for an average scene, sort of middle tone, it does just fine. Other times you may want to use one of the other modes, particularly a spot meter. And I'll talk about that in a minute and when you would use it. There are automatic metering modes in the camera. Different people have different preferences. You're going to set one thing, the camera automatically is going to set the other. Shutter priority, which I don't use, you set the shutter speed and the ISO, and the camera sets the f-stop. A lot of people right now are using manual exposure with what's called auto ISO. You can set up the camera, you can select the highest ISO you want it to pick. You pick the f-stop and the shutter speed, and the camera selects the ISO, and you give it limits. One of the things I don't like about it is you got to be very careful, because if you reach that high limit, anything higher than that, if the camera would try to select it, you would be underexposing the image, and you need to be looking at your little bar down there to see whether or not you have a problem. Okay, let me go back one other thing. I sometimes use aperture priority. Sometimes I use plain manual exposure, which I'll talk about next. Aperture priority with what's called in Nikon easy exposure compensation means I got a wheel that the wheel in the back of the camera actually will allow me to do exposure compensation very quickly, and I can bracket my exposures very easily. But I do have to look at the scene, pick an ISO that's suitable for, I got sunlight, maybe I'm going to put it on 200, 400 ISO. I'm going to pick an aperture according to what I need. If I need speed in case of like this bird, I'm going to pick a small f number. Then I'm going to take a look at that shutter speed. If it isn't high enough, then I'm going to have to start bumping up the ISO until I get it to the point that's at a shutter speed that I feel is adequate to stop the action. But there are situations when you run into problems if you have the camera on some kind of automatic mode. Number one, with the case of the marmot, there's a lot of dark area in this picture. The camera is sort of set to say whatever I'm looking at is going to be middle tone in the picture. So it sees all this black and it says, ooh, it's pretty dark here. I'm going to have to lighten my exposure quite a bit. And the poor little marmot gets washed out. In cases like this, I put the camera on total manual exposure. I set the f-stop, the shutter speed, and the ISO, and you use the little scale and you balance things out. And I'm using a spot meter. In the camera, I have a choice of the matrix, center weighted or spot. I take that spot, I have my focusing point there, and that I put the focusing point over something that's mid-tone on this particular little marmot. And that where that focusing sensor is, that is where the spot meter is going to take a reading. And I've made the adjustment to get the marmot correctly exposed, the most important thing. If it's a little out of place, you can recompose the picture, but you're in a manual setting, nothing changes in terms of your exposure. And you can run into the same problems where you have a bright background. So you're focusing on these guys, you got great exposure on these guys. I put it on manual exposure for these guys because I'm concerned when they take off and they go up into the sky, what happens? That background is lighter than average. And if I had a camera on some kind of automatic mode, it goes, oh, it's really, really bright out here. We're going to make this image a lot darker, and you end up with dark swans in the picture. So if you keep the same setting that you had, manual setting on the ground, and you swing it up to the sky, you might have to bracket a little bit, but you got a better chance of not having the subjects being dark in the picture. You can leave it on like aperture priority, and you know when you swing it up to the sky, you got to hurry up and change your exposure compensation, probably +2, make it lighter. Talking about hunting and photography. There are similarities. Knowledge of the animal is really important. So I'm switching gears here a little bit. I'm going to talk about critters. You might use some kind of hide or blind. You'll see mine later. You might use decoys, cover scents, baiting, game calls. Maybe you have to know something about the animal. You know that the turkey's roosted in a particular place at night, so you know where you're going to probably find them in the morning. But be careful. On federal property, particularly like refuges, etc., you cannot bait. You cannot use game calls. There's a lot of things you cannot do, putting up your own personal blind. So you need to check with regulations for the place that you happen to be working. This thing here that's really weird, it's called a ghillie suit. And you can sit up against a tree, for instance, or against some bushes, and you pretty much disappear into it. But you got to be real still. I don't do well with the ghillie suit. I do much better. Number one, if you get that caught on brush, it's a real problem. Number two, I move too much. So a photo blind is a better choice for me. What about hunters? Hunters are going to be able to shoot something at 100 yards away, maybe even 200 yards away. If you're going to do that with the camera, number one, you got a heck of a lot of atmosphere between you and the subject. That means there's some dust, there's some haze, there's heat ripple. All of that is going to soften the image. And also, most likely, you're not going to get a very big, unless it's an elephant or something, at that distance, you're not going to get a very big image. So we need to depend on two things as photographers. Either it's acceptance that you're going to be in the field and they are going to perceive you as just another animal out there with them and not a predator. You have to behave in that manner, or you're going to use some kind of concealment like a blind, like with the fox, where my moving carefully and so forth probably wouldn't have convinced him of anything. He'd have run off. So let's talk about how to approach your subjects if you want to convince them that you're not a predator. Number one, you kind of want to emulate the movements of the subject. You got a herd of pronghorn. You're going to meander like they do. Keep a low profile. Pause periodically. Play with the bushes a little bit. Don't make any sudden moves. Do not turn directly and walk directly towards the subject and have direct eye contact. You are behaving like a predator then. So you want to watch the general direction that they're moving in and move towards them on an angle that would intersect where they're heading. Void like perfume, soaps, etc. Intense eye contact, not so good. Loud noises. Approach from downwind if you have an animal that has a terrific sense of smell, and certainly that anteater does. If you're in the water, you've got a better chance of being accepted, whether you're in a kayak, canoe, or you're wading in the water, or you have a floating blind that I'll show you later. I've had ducks wading in the water. I have ducks that come right up to me. The last thing there is debated. I just listened to another pro photographer talk, and he thinks the same thing I do. If you have animals that are not particularly skittish, say you're photographing a heron or whatever, I find myself having a conversation with it at a very low monotone way. You know, hey, could you just turn your head a little bit? Yeah, that's better. Okay. It can be annoying to other people around you. However, it does provide the animal with a little sense of safety because they know exactly where you are and you don't sound threatening. Ethics in the field. You don't want to be chasing your animals. You want them to go back to doing what they were doing when you first encountered them. I have seen guys in some of the parks go running up a hill after an elk, and the elk, of course, moves off, and they keep continuing to pursue that elk, and he moves off again. If he doesn't stop and goes back to his normal grazing, etc., or normal behavior that he was doing, you are stressing that animal, and that is not a good ethical thing to do. Don't ever corner an animal. Don't block his escape. Spotting wildlife, it's a learnable skill and it's habitat dependent. If I'm in Texas and I see this rabbit, I can see him because of his shape, because of his color. It doesn't fit in with the rest of the environment. If I go off to the Badlands, the first day I'm there, I'm not a really good spotter of the animals. As I get used to the habitat, the next day I get better and better because I'm used to seeing the general habitat and things that are out of place there. And colors also can pull your eye to your subject. In the Badlands, if I go in the springtime, I know something. I know that around Pinnacles Overlook, young bighorn sheep gather together in little groups and they run back and forth across the formations that are there. And that's pretty common every time I've been there at like late May. Also, so I know to try to capture that kind of behavior. And also, if mom comes around and she starts calling and one of these guys goes towards mom, you know you're going to get some interaction there. So you know to get ready for some shots of mom and the little guy. Movement is important. Where I shot at my friend's house, they were living under both the groundhog and the raccoon were living under this uprooted tree. It must have had 2 compartments and it was covered with vegetation. And the little groundhogs, I had a hard time spotting them, but one of the things I noticed is as soon as they came out of their little hole, they started nibbling on vegetation and the leaves started moving. And as soon as I saw those leaves start moving, not by the wind, by something else, I knew to get the camera positioned over there because one of these guys was going to pop out. There were actually 5 of them there. I check out posts, dead snags, etc. Hawks like to sit up high and be able to look over the terrain to look for food, and they sometimes have favorite posts. The kingfisher here, he dove in, grabbed the crab, he sat there, and he sat on another snag that was nearby, but he had a favorite, and he would come back to that over and over again. So I always would check out these kinds of locations for animals. I listen. Red-bellied woodpecker has a very distinctive call in the springtime. And as soon as I hear it, I'm starting to check out the trees around to look for this fella. With the pileated woodpecker, which is on the left, I heard him. I heard him pounding on the wood. I knew it wasn't the smaller woodpeckers. I knew it was the big boy. And as soon as I heard him, I followed that sound and I was able to locate him and get a couple of pictures. It only happened once on this piece of property. Ospreys, you can hear them before you can see them. They got a very high pitched call and you spot them and then you start following them. Maybe you get a nice shot like this. The widgeon here, they're odd. They have a very high pitched call as they're coming into a group of other widgeons. and I had a pond with other widgeons. I hear this high-pitched call. I look up in the sky. I see the guy coming in. I know he's going to join the group. And if I'm careful, I might get a shot of him plopping down in the water like I did here. When I'm in Chincoteague, and if I'm shooting any place, I'm on the road or whatever, I usually ignore places where I'm not likely to find subjects, like the light isn't very good there, the background is very distracting, etc. So I'm concentrating my efforts on looking in places that the animals are likely to be. If I'm looking for shorebirds, I knew something about shorebirds. They got short legs. They are going to feed in shallow areas. These are winter plumage dunlin. Usually in the springtime, they're a lot prettier, black chest, rusty back. But they need shallow water to feed. So I look for times that either the water level is low because maybe they drain that impoundment some, or maybe the tide is out. And so I could capture these guys fairly close to where I was actually shooting from, which is a road next to this impoundment. Also, if it was a windless day, like this particular day, I got those beautiful reflections. During COVID, at a local park, about 5 minutes from my house, I started the season by doing small little setups. I put out some peanuts and I put a little bird seed out, and I created a little setup like this one here. And I put some perches for the birds to land on. There was a particular stump along the path that was really good for catching small birds. But I got these shots, the 2 chickadee shots and the wren shot by using that. But as the time went on, more and more people were coming to the park, and they were carrying with them large bags of peanuts and a lot of other bird seed, and they'd put it all along the railings in the park, and no longer were the birds interested in anything I had. So I contacted a friend of mine who lived about 5 minutes from my home, and I said, hey, how are things at your house? Can I come over and photograph you? I know you like birds and you got feeders out. So I brought my blind with me, and she allowed me to put it up in her yard. This is from Dick's. There are a number of manufacturers. This is a really lightweight one. You can twist it and put it in a bag. It's set up for shooting with a gun, but you can put mesh camouflage in the windows. You can make arrangement around your lens, etc., a sleeve or whatever. You can cut holes in it and be able to look out through this through this mesh, camouflage mesh. Bottom line is, where you're going to put it. Well, you're going to put it in a place where the birds are likely, or the animals are likely to come. In this case, she had a feeder, she's got water, she's got shelter, everything a bird needs. So I knew I might be able to get some subjects here. I look for what the background looks like behind the area, and sometimes I have a blind for morning, and sometimes I have a blind for afternoon, because the light is better at those times for that particular location. I've had ponds where there's an entrance from like a well water coming into a pond. The ducks tend to hang around that area. That's where I'm going to put the blind. And I might have one set up for morning and one set up for afternoon. But the shots down the bottom here are shots that I got from, I kept changing that setup, but there were shots from there. I also discovered from this company here, sportsmanguide.com, I could get a chair blind. I saw it in an article someplace. And what you do is you sit in the chair and you just pull this frame up over top of you. It's lightweight, it's easy to move. You can put it in a bag and move it. I'll show you a picture that was taken with it in a minute. You can also put feeders out near your window so that you could actually be inside the house, open the window, camouflage you and where the lens happens to be, put some kind of screen there of some sort, like that camouflage mesh, and you can shoot out your window and get some nice shots. In the case of this upright log here, what I did, I found a log and I said, hey, that looks really good. This would be good for woodpeckers. And so my friend and I worked on this. We got a bucket. We took the log, we put it in the bucket, and we poured wet cement around it. And it was easy to take. Well, it wasn't easy to move, but it was because it was heavy. But I could move it from one location to another. So I could put it in places maybe where I have a suet feeder. I could put mealworms on the top where I might pick up a wren instead of the woodpecker. These 2 shots here were done from that chair blind. So you're able to get fairly close to subjects, and it accepted it. You can, I mentioned, photograph in the water. Years upon years ago, maybe 20 more, I had this stupid little I think it was an ice blind. Anyhow, so all you got to do is break up the outline of it. So I just spray painted it some, and I took a picture of this guy down here, pied-billed, pied-billed grebe. They nest on platforms of rotting vegetation. He would go off, he'd flop the vegetation over top the eggs because it was kind of warm. He'd go off, fish, come back, uncover the eggs, plop back on the eggs. And I was in that blind photographing him. I had gone to a local salvage yard and I bought some blocks of styrofoam that were sort of, well, we'll say 2x4s in terms of styrofoam. I hooked them together. I put the ends of the blind, those poles into the styrofoam, and I was able to float this across this little channel and get that picture. You can go and buy something, or you can make your own floating blind. These Gerlach uses this one. I do have one. I haven't had a chance to use it, but you're basically standing up. But the camera is close to water level so that you can photograph ducks and other waterfowl and animals eye level, which is kind of nice, but you can make your own kind of floating situation as well. I said that, you know, animals are more comfortable with you in the water. I shoot a lot from the car. It's like having a mobile blind. I can move it along with my subjects. I made a bean bag, what I call a bean bag, which would be, this one would be like one purchased, or this one here, which will go over the windowsill of a car. Some other people use other things. In that bean bag, I have either rice, beans, or birdseed. I don't like the little plastic pellets, don't work particularly well. You can buy something called a skimmer pod where you can put a ball head or a gimbal head on top of it, and you can scoot along the sand or the mud or so forth, and you can be real low to the ground when you're using it. The advantage of having the car, very simply, I was at Merritt Island. They have a drive that goes around Merritt Island. The birds are used to seeing cars stop along the drive and taking pictures of them. And these guys were moving back and forth with a school of fish. So I was able to move the car back and forth and keep a number of the birds in the frame. I'm going to take a second here again. I do like places where you've kind of got an impoundment and you've got a dike road, and alongside the dike road is a little waterway real close to the road. Chincoteague has that, and there are other places. Edwin B. Forsyth, that used to be Brigantine. Their channels not always as close as I would like them, but there's other places like Merritt Island that the channels are fairly close, and you can get some really nice shots of animals you wouldn't normally maybe get that close to. You can go great distance away and go take pictures and spend lots of money. So you can go to the Pantanal in Brazil and you can get jaguar, and you can go to Alaska and get bears with salmon, and you can go to Norway and get a ring seal sitting on an ice floe, but you don't have to do that. If you got some places where water is limited and you got some fresh water, that pool might be a good place to set up, where there's some springs, where there's open water in the winter, where the rest of the pond happens to be frozen, but there's an area that's open and the ducks come into it. Inlets and waterways like at Sebastian Inlet in Florida, I found was a great place. There are a lot of fish that migrate back and forth. It was a great place to get osprey pictures because there were about 8 of them feeding in that particular little stretch of water. Along the beach, you look along the rack line, and the line where a lot of things come up, debris comes up on the shore. I'm gonna have to excuse me 1 second. Sorry. Okay, I'm back on again. I also look in picnic grounds, campgrounds, because lots of times people drop crumbs and so forth. So you get some maybe chipmunks around there. You might get some little squirrels or whatever. In this case, at this picnic area, I happened to discover something that I really like is repeated behavior. This little squirrel would go up a tree, pine tree, knock down pine cones, go down to the ground, grab them, take them, go hide the pine cones, come back and repeat the whole procedure. So you were able to predict where he was going and get some pictures. But you can go to a local park, you can go to a local zoo, garden, and sometimes you have wild birds, for instance, or other animals like fox that are used to seeing people. And there's food there. For instance, this was taken at the Albuquerque Zoo. There were pinion waterfowl in this big pond, but there also were widgeon and wood ducks that would be wild and fly into this area. And so you could get some really good pictures fairly close. And these birds were not nervous around people. I look for food sources, and this was a juniper tree. Anyway, you got berries, anything that has food like holly trees that might have red berries on them. You want to look at those places and check them out very carefully for a lot of activity, because you might get this cedar waxwing, for instance, there with a berry. I do love wildlife refuges, particularly national wildlife refuges, because they are managed for wildlife. And I want to point out, they often have impoundments. The one in Chincoteague, they manage for wildlife. They drain some of the impoundments at the end of winter so that they prepare a mud-like habitat for migrating shorebirds. So they got a place to settle and rest and eat on their way to their nesting grounds. But also those same impoundments, they'll flood at other times, particularly like in the fall, to attract migrating waterfowl. So different places, like I mentioned earlier, where we saw the turkey, Bosque del Apache plants grains for a variety of birds, both snow geese, sandhill cranes, and also the turkeys took advantage of it. There are other places where you have, this is something I saw it about 10 years ago in Texas, and now there are more of these areas. Domestic wastewater plants that have treated the water to a certain extent, but it still has some nitrogen and phosphorus in it. And if they discharge that wastewater into a stream, you'd have problems, or into another waterway, because lots of times the algae will go after the phosphorus and nitrogen, and you get algal blooms and you get some toxicity with it. And sometimes the algae, when it dies, goes down to the bottom, bacteria eats it, and they use up oxygen, so you get some dead spots in the water where oxygen is very low. So they started doing what's called wetland treatment. Either you have a marsh, man-made or natural, and they discharge the waste into that marsh. It's sanitized, and the plants take up phosphorus and nitrogen, and they grow really well, and then they attract a lot of organisms around them, and then you get fish, and then you get birds. And in a lot of these places, either there's a dike road that you can drive or walk, because they have impoundments there with these marsh plants. Some of them have boardwalks like Waxahachie, which is hard to say, and Green Cay, where you actually have some of the birds just nesting right there. And you walk along the boardwalk, and the birds don't care that you're there. They're used to seeing people and not being harmed. This was from Orlando Wetlands. That was from a road impoundment. I just walked it and would sit there with this guy, Limpkin. When are you going to go shoot? Fall, you get fall migration, particularly if you're looking for warblers. It's good to look in places where the warblers have to cross a large body of water. They might run into a headwind, or they just get tuckered, and they plop out in the nearest land that they come to. In Texas, it might be Padre Island, or High Island in Texas is one of the famous places. If they're crossing the Great Lakes, Point Pelee is a very famous place where they have a big festival for what they call the spring fallout, and you can get pictures of a lot of birds that you wouldn't normally get. I like breeding season because you get nuptial plumes with this. This is a snowy egret. You get some neat colors. This was an Anhinga. This is actually a cattle egret. Doesn't look like he normally does. There's also places that there are rookeries. There's one in Ocean City, New Jersey now, near the Welcome Center. Alligator Farm, St. Augustine, and Gatorland near Orlando are two of them, where you get courtship behavior, you get nesting behavior, you get a lot of activity. And then there's the wintering grounds, where one of them that's famous that I go to a lot is Bosque del Apache, for thousands upon thousands of snow geese, plus sandhill cranes in the thousands. Anticipating action. You want to be ready to grab a shot of something interesting. Hawks will often stretch their wings before they're ready to fly. So number one, I know he's going to fly soon, and I want to grab my shots real quick, and maybe I can get him in flight. This belted kingfisher stretched his wings before he dove. If you're around terns, one of the things that you'll find with a flock of terns is periodically one will raise its wing, and then another one in the group will raise its wings and settle down, and another one will, and you start seeing this rippling across the group of terns, the flock. Lots of times you will need to be ready for them to take off. That's a good sign that they're probably going to lift off, and you can get some really neat pictures. Also, if you see a bird like this one heading towards land and you got a bunch of these guys on the ground, you kind of know where he's going to go. This guy, I watched his behavior, I watched the path he was taking, and I was ready for this action shot because of that. I saw aggressive behavior on the part of this one swan. His neck was out straight, he was squawking, and he was heading at a very rapid pace to another group of swans, so I knew to be ready to try to capture some action shots. Snow geese, if they're on the ground and you got a nice flock of them and they start getting noisy, they start getting chattery, and they kind of look around a little bit nervous, get ready for them to take off. It doesn't always happen, but it's a good indication. Sandhill cranes lean before they fly. A lot of birds take a particular posture. You know that shorebirds go in and out and follow the surf. So you know that this guy is going to move in front of this wave for sure because he doesn't want to get swamped. If a bird is bathing, if it's been preening, often it will shake off afterwards, like this is a little pied-billed grebe here. Ducks will flap their wings, so will the puffins, to get rid of those loose feathers, or they'll ruffle their feathers trying to get rid of the loose ones. So it's a good time to look for action. If one animal approaches another, it's a good time to look for some kind of interaction as well. It could be friendly. It doesn't always mean there's something going to happen, but you want to be prepared for it. This case, I don't know whether it was friendly or otherwise, but I know this one wasn't too friendly. Somebody was in somebody else's territory near somebody else's nest. So last thing, safety. Do not corner an animal or block its way, or you could get hurt. Don't get between like a mama bear and the little guys, the little cubs. Don't get between a male that's in rut and his group of females. Watch out for slippery surfaces, simple things like moss. In this case, it was seaweed that I had to be really careful about when I photographed him. Watch where you point, put your hands or lie down. You saw the prairie rattler, number one, and you also saw the cactus. You don't want to land on that. Incoming tide, I've seen people be out on a peninsula and all of a sudden the tide comes in some places fairly rapidly, and all of a sudden they're on an island instead of a peninsula. Some mud can be really dangerous, particularly in the Carolinas, but I've had trouble down around Tangier where you step in an area and all of a sudden you go down to your knees basically in mud and have a difficult time getting out. Lyme disease is a big deal in this area, so you want to spray your clothes with something that would kill the ticks, and usually that's permethrin. You do not put it on your skin. You let it dry. You can wash your clothes a couple times. It's what the Army uses for field exercises in places like Edgewood. If you're going to go out of the country, make sure you go to a travel clinic that can make you familiar with health problems there, and also give you the shots that you need. I step in holes a lot. This was in Iceland, and I stepped between two rocks that were covered by moss, and I had a backpack on, and I stepped in that hole, fell backwards, and sprained my ankle pretty bad. And luckily it was at the end of the trip. But they're simple little things. I have a friend of mine that didn't take enough water, and he ended up with either heat stroke, or there's two of them. Anyway, the one that didn't kill you, but he ended up in the hospital. Last thing I want to mention, use telephoto lenses to provide a safe distance, working distance from animals, particularly things like elk and bison and moose. And beware some of the signs of aggression, like, for instance, the elk will thrash at the grass, urinate, and so forth when he's getting ready to approach some females and he's not in a good state of mind. You want to be careful, stay away, watch out for crowds around animals. This is not wise. Encourage people to back away, and you also to back away. You've seen a lot of videos this year of dummies approaching bison too close, kids going up to the bison, and the bison taking its horns and flipping them. Just because animals are in a national park does not mean they're tame. That's the end of the program, except for one little thing here. If you're going to travel, you may want to look at this particular website, PhotographAmerica.com. The author is Hitchman. He's been doing guides to places all over the U.S. It's mainly U.S., and he has information on where to photograph and what you're going to get at different seasons and what trails are the best, etc. So whenever I plan a trip, lots of times I'll grab past newsletters, and you can buy older newsletters. He's got a nice catalog and all. But I'll take a look at the newsletters for the particular area I'm going to. Also, I do belong to an organization that's called NAMPA. Their site is nampa.org. They are an advocate group for, it's North American Nature Photography Association, and they're an advocate group for photographers, nature photographers. They protect our rights, and they also have a tremendous number of webinars that can be quite useful to take. I mean, it's like 100 or more that you can check out once you're a member. And with that, I want to thank you all. I'm going to try to get out of this in a second, but my website again is ospreyphoto.com. My email is ospreyphoto, no O, so ospreyphoto@aol.com. And I hope to see some of you in some of my workshops, and we're going to try to move out of this and see if with some help, I might be able to get back over to, let's see, let me get you out of the way here. Where down the bottom am I going to find the little thing? There it is. And I'm going to get out of share, and I'm going to turn things back over to the guys in charge. Hi. I'm open for any questions. You can let people, maybe you've seen some questions that have come up, maybe in a chat or whatever, but people can go ahead and ask questions if they turn their audio on.
Thank you. I have a few comments to read to you that people said. Linda says, beautiful images. Glad I came tonight. Scott says, really nice images that are the result of a great deal of time spent. Careful observation, timing. Love the deer with a mouthful, not quite the usual headshot of wildlife. I'm envious. And Ron said, very nice images, helpful advice on animal photography. And then Leslie says, wonderful presentation and photos. Barbara says, wow, loved this. Such wonderful photographs. And Lawrence says, excellent.
Well, I love hearing those comments. And, I try to do a program that's based on my experience, number one, not on theory. And also, I try to reach a number of different levels. In other words, people that are maybe just starting out photographing wildlife, or maybe have been doing something else and are just curious. And also for the people that are more advanced, to try to provide information for everybody. So I'm glad people appreciated the program. And if you have questions, can they share them?
I've asked a few times for questions. People just seem to really like your presentation. Susan says, wow, great shots. Lots of great information and photos. So I'll give them one more.
I've been doing presentations. This is like my 25th. And one of the things I try to do is all the questions that were presented to me in earlier programs, I've tried to put the answers into the program so that I cover a lot of them. One of them that I typically get asked and is not in the program is about polarizers. I don't use polarizers with wildlife usually. Polarizers are great, give you, you got a nice blue sky and fluffy clouds, and you use the polarizer. You can show that if you want to get shine off the surface of leaves for fall color, or at a waterfalls to get the shine off of rocks. Polarizer is great. For animals, number one, just putting the polarizer on, you lose the stop and a half worth of light. And number two, if they're moving around and so forth, you can't be reaching out there and adjusting the polarizer. So no, I don't use polarizers usually with wildlife.
I think you must have answered most people's questions through your presentation. Here's one. Julie asks, where do you learn about wildlife you plan to shoot?
Internet. I learned one thing about groundhogs. I learned that I moved my blind a little closer to where that den was. And I'm sitting in the blind and I'm going, oh, I hear this bird. And it's a little high pitch noise. And I'm saying, oh, that's definitely a bird. I don't know what bird that is. And it's getting closer. And it almost sounds like, almost sounds like that's where that den is for the groundhog. And eventually I concluded it was the groundhog. So I went back to the web when I got home and I looked up groundhogs, and another name for them is whistle pig. And so it was the groundhog whistling an alarm call for the little ones.
Okay. Are you still there?
Oh, I think we might have lost her.
Yeah, she froze up.
For instance, there's a weird thing that I've seen, and apparently it is real. In the Badlands, a number of years ago, in the back of a prairie dog colony, I happened to see a coyote moving along, and behind him, trailing him, was a badger. And the coyote would go along, and the badger would follow him. And the coyote would go along, and the badger would follow him. And then all of a sudden, the coyote might turn around and growl at the badger, and the badger would flatten out on the ground. Then they get up and they go off and do the same thing. And so I talked to the refuge people or the park people. I guess actually it was a wildlife, Fish and Wildlife in the city, in the town of Wall. But anyhow, they told me they've seen that before, and they don't quite know. Maybe there's some kind of symbiotic relationship between the two of them, that there's an advantage of them hunting together. So talking to people about things that you see is certainly a good way to learn. And also, you've got the internet. Also, there's programs. There's a lot of nature programs that are pretty good. You can get some ideas. And also, there's a number of the webinars that are out there, YouTube presentations. If you're a Nikon shooter, a guy named he's got Backcountry Gallery is the name, Steve Perry, for Nikon equipment, for exposure, for autofocus tips, and so forth. This guy is really, really good, and I'm sure there's somebody from Canon that's very similar.
JC asks, do you use the teleconverter for moving subjects?
Yeah, it slows down your shutter speeds a little bit, but now that you can raise, some of the cameras are so much better at slightly higher ISOs. So if I'm shooting at like 800 ISO or whatever, my lenses, usually it's, well, the maximum aperture on the 600 is a 4, maximum aperture on the 2-5 is a 5.6. But yeah, the teleconverter will work with action, just like with that belted kingfisher. You're going to lose a little bit of light. You might have to run at a little higher ISO to get the shots, to make sure that your shutter speeds are fast enough. You need to look at that shutter speed and see if it's fast enough for the action you're viewing.
Paul asks if you have any suggestions for finding or shooting birds with a snowy background.
Go north. I did a program just recently, maybe, I don't know, it's a couple weeks ago. One nice thing about Zooms is I do programs all over, and one of them was in Minnesota, and I actually got to judge their photo contest thing. And I was amazed, number one, with the quality of the shots. But one of the things I noticed is they got great owl shots, because the owls, they're up near the border with Canada, and a lot of the owls, great gray owls and whatever, come down to their territory, and you got snow on the ground. So go out to Western Maryland, for instance, might be a possibility. Also, Middle Creek in Pennsylvania. I don't know what the snow situation is there, but look it up on the web and look at the time frame. But for snow geese, it is a great location for some other wildlife as well. It's called Middle Creek in Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you. And then Julie says she attended one of your presentations at Ward Museum in Salisbury in about 2010.
That's a long time ago. Long time ago. I've been around for a while.
That looks like the end of our questions.
Christine, you want to give a last call for questions, and we'll give a little bit of time for Facebook to catch up. Irene, you mentioned a newsletter. How can people sign up to that, and how often do you publish?
Just go to my website, www.ospreyphoto.com, and when you get to that website, there's a little block on the side, and it's where you can sign up for the newsletter. You can put your information in there. It'll send you an email so that you can confirm that you really want the newsletter, and then you go on my list automatically. And like I say, about every 2 months, I'll send it out. Sometimes it's stories, like I say, the scarecrow and the wren and the cowbird story is kind of interesting. Sometimes it's a review of a particular location and some of the things that I saw there and some suggestions for shooting. The information on Topaz, Denoise, and Sharpen AI, both of those are covered in my new newsletter that I'm working on right now.
Okay, thank you very much. and we're getting several thank yous for your presentation. So I'm going to take it that means people's questions have all been answered. And I want to thank you.
It's been a pleasure being here and talking to you all. I do appreciate the opportunity. If there's any other camera clubs around, that I think I got Carroll County coming up. I think the practice sessions this week. But anyway, I've got a little space left in early April and a little in March in terms of picking up any other camera clubs. I'm just about full between practice sessions, and I've got maybe 20 more to do. So I've had a total since August of people, different clubs signing up. It's about 43 so far. So I did not expect this kind of thing, but I have somebody from Michigan that contacted a friend with Richmond Digital Photography Group, and now they've picked me up. So information kind of spreads. But anyhow, if you like the presentation and you know of some other clubs or some other folks that like to hear it. Also, I'm doing something for Hopkins. I believe it's on the 17th. It's the same program. You got to pay for it. But it's $25. It's with the Odyssey program in Johns Hopkins University. And I'm almost sure, I wonder if I can do this and check this without screwing things up. Yeah, it's the 17th at 6:30, but you can go to the Odyssey, Johns Hopkins Odyssey program. Also, look at my Facebook page. There's a link. There's information with the picture of the Kingfisher on my Facebook page, which happens to be, of course, Facebook. Osprey Photo Workshops is my Facebook page, and there's information on registering for that.
Okay. And a lot of thank yous. So many people appreciate your presentation, and some people say it's one of the best they've ever seen.
Okay.
And I want to just remind the club that next week is our contest for close up and macro. Please have your images in to Lewis by 12 noon on Tuesday. And thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you, Irene, for your wonderful presentation.
I may have some other programs for y'all later. So I'm working on one on Barrier Islands, Assateague, and Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. So keep me in mind for the future.
Okay. Thank you, Irene. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Irene, hang on. We're going to end the stream, and we'll be right back with you. And everybody else, thanks so much. We'll see you next week.